Denazification is defined as a process of purging German society of everything that, until then, linked it to the Nazi legacy. After Germany was defeated in World War II, the Allies undertook a series of demilitarization and decartelization processes in the very area where the Third Reich was forged. These were intended to prevent the re-emergence of a violent movement with ideas of racial supremacy, such as National Socialism. Today, in this new installment of military history, we will examine post-war Germany and how Nazi ideology was treated once the war ended.
Los vencedores se centraron en los niños y las personas jóvenes para darles una perspectiva diferente. Se preparó a los alemanes vencidos para que se reincorporaran a la comunidad de naciones democráticas mediante una nueva cultura y una nueva política.
¿Tendríamos que sofocarlos para siempre? ¿Matarlos a todos? ¿O animarles y darles la oportunidad de llevar una vida?
Pero llevaría mucho tiempo. Y las sombras del pasado nunca desaparecerían completamente.
At the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, the Allied side faced the daunting task of initiating a complete overhaul of German society as a whole. All its inhabitants had been exposed for 12 years to Nazi propaganda devised by Joseph Goebbels. Therefore, they needed to be re-educated to erase from their minds the effects of having lived under a regime of hatred. In 1946, the writer Victor Klemperer echoed this problem. It had permeated the skin and blood of the people through single words, idioms, and statements imposed in a million repetitions and assimilated mechanically and unconsciously. The Allied countries forced Germans to face their recent past. The high-ranking officials of the National Socialist government had to be presented for what they had been, perpetrators of crimes against humanity. The cult of Adolf Hitler and the consequences of spreading his sinister ideas had to be eliminated at all costs. Unprecedentedly, the courts responsible for judging war crimes extended their verdict to the propagandists. They had instigated hatred and the persecution of groups of people through harmful words, articles, and images directed at Jews, Roma, and other communities. From the arrival of the Allied occupation forces, the display of any item linked to Nazi symbolism was prohibited, from the German salute, which was performed with the arm raised, to swastikas. Furthermore, as awareness-raising exercises, films about concentration camps were shown to the majority of the inhabitants. Films such as Die Todesmühlen and Welt im Filmnummer 5 inches caused many viewers to cover their faces, filled with guilt and disgust. At the Ettersberg Detention Center, residents of neighboring Weimar were gathered to contemplate the mountains of human bodies massacred by their compatriots. Street signs displayed images of extermination camps with inscriptions that read, "These atrocities your fault."
Los vencedores se centraron en los niños y las personas jóvenes para darles una perspectiva diferente. Se preparó a los alemanes vencidos para que se reincorporaran a la comunidad de naciones democráticas mediante una nueva cultura y una nueva política.
The most fervent Nazis were precisely the youngest, as this worldview was the only one they had been exposed to, having grown up in Germany during the rise of the National Socialist Party. This change in mentality began to take place through concrete measures. All traces of Third Reich propaganda were eliminated from the curricula at different educational levels. Speeches by teachers, journalists, and ministers of various religious professions who insisted on disseminating fascist postulates were censored. Parades, military hymns, and the use of National Socialist insignia and symbols were banned. Monuments, statues, emblems, and advertisements that exalted militaristic sentiments were demolished. Property linked to the Hitlerite Party was confiscated, and the names of streets, squares, parks, and buildings alluding to the Nazi regime were changed.
Primero se destruyeron las imágenes y los símbolos bajo los que el país había sido gobernado durante 12 años. Las emblemáticas estatuas del Führer se hicieron pedazos.
The Allies resolved to thoroughly investigate every member of German society to determine their degree of participation in National Socialist barbarism. To this end, they tested methods such as the Fragebogen, political questionnaires, that citizens were required to complete. At the end of the war, the Nazi Party still had 8 million members, so approximately 16 million of these surveys were distributed in Western Germany. This survey consisted of a 12-page document with 133 questions that had to be answered promptly. The political questionnaires, which were distributed to all Germans under occupation by the Allied countries, required specific information to determine the respondents' degree of complicity with the fallen regime. The questionnaires asked whether the respondent had been associated with the NSDAP, had voted for the Nazis in the elections, had collaborated in any way with Hitler's government, among other questions. The results of this census were relevant to the future development of citizens in public life. Through their responses, each person was distinguished according to various categories of responsibility: exonerated, sympathizer, moderately involved, and primarily guilty. Each classification determined whether a person could access certain jobs or which ration card they could receive. Then a problem arose. Most of the senior positions in the country's public administration had been strongly implicated in Nazism. This meant that a general purge of public employment could completely disrupt the social system. The Fragebogen represented a fundamental event in the Allied occupation of German territory.
What Nazi organizations did you join, mein Herr? What's been your source of income, meine Frau? Did you fight the Nazis? If so, how? The job was tough, the Germans cynical.
Gathering intelligence was essential for the Allies to understand the state of affairs. That is, to understand how deeply rooted Nazism was among Germans. This worked for the general population, but at the same time, trials were also held for the high-ranking officers who survived the fall of Berlin. The Allied member countries agreed that the capture and subsequent punishment of these leaders was a priority. What they disagreed on was how to implement these actions. Some preferred to hang or execute those responsible for the Holocaust outright, while the final option was to hold public trials. Clearly, the laws of the Third Reich could not be used to prosecute these Nazi leaders, nor was there international legislation in force on which to base any possible convictions. In this sense, it was decided to create the Nuremberg Principles from a combination of the 1907 Hague Code and the decrees of the 1928 Geneva Convention. One point against this approach was the non-retroactivity of criminal law. This meant that it was not possible to try someone for an act that was not stipulated as a crime at the time of its execution. Another remarkable aspect was that the Nuremberg Trials served as global recognition of the Nazi regime's crimes against humanity. This circumstance was further exacerbated in Germany itself, which was, in a sense, purifying itself before the world to rejoin the international community. Furthermore, the fact that the powerful leaders of the National Socialist Party were singled out and punished served as an exemplary example for those who still supported Hitler. From any perspective, these trials marked a before and after in modern history. The Allied authorities ensured that paper, a scarce resource at the time, was available so that newspapers could report on the criminal proceedings at all times. In the most important trial, 24 individuals representing every stratum of political life were charged. The 4 crimes examined were common planning or conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Of those 24 defendants, 11 were sentenced to death. However, the most eminent figure who had survived the war, Hermann Göring, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, found a way to commit suicide in his cell before having to go to the gallows. From many perspectives, the Nuremberg trials were unprecedented. Never before had such a large number of leaders of a country been put on trial, much less by a tribunal appointed by its military conquerors. But not all of Germany received the same treatment. It's time to delve into the Eastern German side, which after World War II fell into the hands of the Soviet Union. There, the methods of dealing with denazification were different.
En la zona soviética, la desnazificación era más dura que en el oeste. Los ocupantes soviéticos eran los aliados más radicales. Despojaban a los nazis de sus trabajos, los sentenciaban y los confinaban en campos. Cientos de miles huyeron a las zonas occidentales para escapar de ellos.
The Soviets weren't afraid to offer mercy. In fact, they didn't hesitate to severely reprimand those who, until recently, had been cheering the Führer. The Russians opted to impose denazification by force. Their main priority was not to establish democratic elections on German soil. Rather, they sought to establish a satellite state under Stalin's command. East Germany's strategic position offered an ideal enclave between the USSR and the rest of Europe. This was even more relevant considering the growing distance between the United States and the Soviet Union, thus generating a two-party world.
Las autoridades militares soviéticas también pasaron el trabajo de desnazificación a los alemanes. No solo era cuestión de erradicar el nazismo. La purga se extendía también a aquellos que no querían aceptar el régimen de Stalin.
In East Germany, the Russians often detained Germans in concentration camps. Those who remained in the cities suffered all kinds of deprivations, as a warning for their past under Nazi rule. During those same years, the other Allies ignored the Nazi mentality of the German researchers they brought to their territories to direct projects that would benefit the United States and other Western countries. For example, the Americans imported 785 German scientists who would ultimately be instrumental in the development of their space project. Given Germany's role as a buffer against Soviet influence in the West, the United States decided to implement the Marshall Plan. This was an American initiative to assist Western Europe in its reconstruction and economic recovery. A European continent in ruins could only represent an opportunity for the international expansion of capitalism. Thanks to this plan, the German miracle was fostered, a period of post-war prosperity that led to European political stability. This succession of events led to a democratic spring in the western regions of occupied Germany. In 1949, a new constitution was proclaimed for that territory, the Basic Law for the Federal Republic of Germany. It contained the so-called Eternity Clause, which protected sections from being modified by a potential authoritarian government. These were Articles 1 and 20, which endowed the new state with the attributes of being democratic, federal, and social. Article 20 stipulated a right of resistance in the event that the aforementioned articles were violated. Since 1953, the Federal Republic of Germany, and later reunified Germany, has compensated the State of Israel with the sum of 46 billion euros at current exchange rates. Furthermore, the European country gave Israel the freedom to participate in its education system, particularly in teaching about the Holocaust. On May 5, 1955, the Federal Republic of Germany was once again recognized as a sovereign and independent nation in the international arena. After all the work accomplished by the victorious forces, a valid question is, did their measures to eradicate Nazi ideology work? The following images are revealing in this regard.
Cientos de neonazis se han concentrado en el este de Alemania para festejar el cumpleaños de Adolf Hitler. Y para ello han organizado un festival que durará hasta el domingo y que incluye conciertos, actividades deportivas, una feria de tatuajes y la venta de productos con eslóganes e imágenes de la extrema derecha.
The well-attended celebration of Hitler's birthday in the town of Ostritz, on the border between Germany and Poland, is a clear sign of the relevance of National Socialist notions in the current situation. Among the younger generations, a wave of racial supremacists who advocate for a Europe consolidated by ethnic purity continues to develop. The factors that foster this fascist breeding ground are numerous and varied. In Germany alone, there is a clear industrial decline, and the economic conditions of the old continent suffer from the divergences of a complex multipolar world. And on the social level, the lack of community ties isolates individuals, which ends up exacerbating the various conflicting ideologies, increasingly alienating their sympathizers. This current state of affairs, thanks to globalization, has long since acquired a global character. The rise of the new right is widespread, to the point that pro-Nazi political parties are emerging. or rulers with ideas that serve the general unrest are coming to power. In a way, the young people of these decades are experiencing circumstances similar to those at the end of the Weimar Republic. The serpent's egg is still there. Thus, it is unavoidable that the mistakes of the past can be repeated, and perhaps even in even worse forms. Now, after exploring why Germany was denazified so quickly after World War II, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for following us until the end. We look forward to seeing you again in our next video.